The atmosphere inside La Maison Royale was more dazzling than ever tonight. The crystal chandeliers shimmered against the high ceiling, blending with the warm glow of candlelight, making the entire space feel luxurious and magnificent. Guests dressed in elegant evening attire gracefully raised their glasses, engaging in conversation and laughter over meticulously crafted dishes. Emma, an 18-year-old girl with soft brown hair and determined eyes, skillfully poured wine for a VIP table. She had been working here for over a year and had grown accustomed to the scrutinizing glances and rude remarks from the wealthy patrons. But tonight, there was one man who made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't ignore. Richard Langley, a millionaire in the financial world, sat comfortably at a large table near the center of the dining hall. He wore an expensive designer suit, his chiseled face framed by slick-back hair. His gaze swept over the menu before landing on something else. Emma. He didn't bother to hide his assessment as he eyed her from head to toe, a smirk forming on his lips. A man sitting beside him chuckled, lightly patting Richard on the shoulder. Into the innocent type again? Don't tell me you're actually interested in a little waitress. Richard smirked, lifting his glass of red wine and swirling it slowly. Interested? Number. But I'm certain she won't refuse an invitation from me. He gestured for a waiter. Bring that waitress over here. Emma heard it, but she deliberately ignored it. She had seen this kind of situation too many times. Wealthy men flaunting their power, treating servers like just another part of their lavish meal, rather than real people. Victor, the restaurant manager, immediately stepped up, lowering his voice but maintaining authority. Emma, Mr. Langley would like you to serve his table personally. Emma glanced at the table, where Richard waited confidently, his gaze filled with arrogance. I'll serve the wine, but I don't take special requests. Victor frowned. Are you refusing a VIP guest? Do you think you have the right to choose? Emma didn't back down. I'm just doing my job. Nothing more, nothing less. But Victor didn't give her another chance to refuse. He gently but firmly pushed her toward the table, his expression warning her. Just pour the wine. Don't upset the guest. Emma clenched her teeth, picked up the bottle of red wine, and approached Richard's table. He watched her with amusement, as if she were an interesting prize. What's your name? He asked. Emma kept her professional demeanor and responded briefly, Emma. Richard smirked and raised his glass toward her. Drink with me. Emma hesitated for a moment, then met his eyes directly and shook her head. Sorry, but I don't drink while working. The table's atmosphere suddenly grew tense. A few guests turned their heads, waiting to see what would happen next. Richard wasn't used to being turned down, especially not by a young waitress. He set his glass down, folded his arms across his chest, his gaze sharp. Do you know who I am? Emma's voice remained steady. I only know that you're a customer at this restaurant. A man at the table chuckled, whispering, First time I've seen someone completely unimpressed by you, Richard. Richard frowned slightly, but then let out a low chuckle. Interesting. All right, we'll take it slow. Emma placed the bottle back on the table and spoke softly. Enjoy your meal. Then she turned away, leaving Richard sitting there, a mixture of irritation and intrigue on his face. Not far away, another man had witnessed the entire exchange. Johnny Depp, seated in a discreet corner of the restaurant, watched in silence. His expression was calm, but inside something stirred. He had seen this scenario far too often. Men with money thinking they could manipulate everything with wealth and power. He kept observing. He knew this wasn't over yet. The tension inside La Maison Royale heightened as Richard Langley stepped away from the table, his gaze never leaving Emma. The banquet was nearing its end, with only a few lingering guests still sipping their last drinks before leaving. Emma busied herself clearing the remaining wine glasses, doing everything she could to avoid Richard's eyes, but she could sense something was off. Richard slowly stood up, adjusting his suit jacket before signaling to Victor, the restaurant manager. I want her to accompany me. Victor nodded immediately without hesitation. Emma froze, turning sharply toward him. What did you just say? Victor shrugged as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Escorting VIP guests to their cars is part of your duty. Emma clenched her fists, her voice turning cold. Escorting them doesn't mean getting in the car with them. Richard chuckled, stepping closer, lowering his voice. You might be underestimating my offer. He pulled a blank check from the pocket of his tailored vest and placed it on the table in front of Emma. Write down any number you want. The other waitstaff quickly turned away, pretending not to see, but the air in the room suddenly grew thick with tension. Emma took a deep breath, locking eyes with Richard. Sorry, but I'm not for sale. This time, Richard's smirk froze. He wasn't used to being rejected, especially not by an unremarkable waitress. Victor, seeing the guest's displeasure, immediately intervened. Emma, don't be foolish. This is a golden opportunity. Emma snapped her head toward Victor, glaring. A golden opportunity for what? To be used and discarded like an expired toy? Victor's polite demeanor cracked. Do you really think you have the right to refuse? This restaurant survives on guests like Mr. Langley. If he wants something, employees like you are expected to comply. Emma's chest tightened with anger. She couldn't believe her own manager was willing to sell out his staff for money. But before she could respond, a deep, steady voice cut through the tension from behind. Who told you this restaurant exists because of guests like Langley? Everyone turned their heads. Johnny Depp stood there, his black shirt buttoned neatly, his slick-back hair giving him a sharp, commanding presence. His piercing gaze swept across the scene. No one knew how long he had been standing there, but it was clear he had heard everything. Inside the restaurant, the waitstaff, chefs, and even a few remaining guests had stopped what they were doing, silently watching the confrontation unfold. Victor forced an awkward smile, trying to maintain professionalism. Mr. Depp, this is just a little misunderstanding. I was simply trying to optimize the restaurant's best interests. Johnny stepped forward, his presence overpowering. This restaurant doesn't need people who optimize profits by selling out their employees. Victor's face turned pale. What do you mean? Johnny met his gaze, his words cutting through the air like a blade. You're fired, effective immediately. The restaurant fell silent. Victor stared in shock. Fired? I've worked here for 10 years. You have no right. Johnny cut him off, his voice sharp as steel. I'm the largest shareholder of La Maison Royale. I have every right. Victor's mouth fell open, his face drained of color. The staff exchanged stunned glances. They all knew Johnny was a VIP, but none of them had realized he was actually one of the restaurant's owners. I can explain, Victor stammered, sweat forming on his brow. Johnny didn't bother listening. Pack your things and don't ever show your face at any La Maison Royale establishment again. Victor stood frozen, but he knew he had no way out. Furious, he yanked off his tie, turned sharply and stormed out of the restaurant. Only then did the tension in the room ease slightly. Johnny turned toward Emma. She was still in shock. She hadn't expected Johnny to not only stand up for her, but to fire Victor on the spot. Richard, who had been watching the scene unfold, slowly picked up his wine glass, swirling the liquid inside before flashing a sly grin. So, you're the one in charge here? How interesting. Johnny didn't acknowledge his taunt. He simply looked at Emma and asked, his voice calm yet concerned. Are you all right? Emma inhaled deeply and nodded. I'm fine, thank you. Johnny nodded slightly before turning his gaze back to Richard. And Mr. Langley, in case it wasn't clear, Emma's not a commodity. You don't get to choose her. Richard raised an eyebrow, his smirk still lingering. Are you playing the hero? Johnny shrugged. Number, but I know the difference between a person and property. Richard studied him for a moment before chuckling, casually slipping on his jacket. I'll let this slide today, but remember, everything has a price. It's only a matter of time. He turned and walked away. Emma clenched her fists, but she didn't say anything. She knew men like Richard wouldn't give up easily, but at least tonight, she had refused to surrender to fate. Johnny watched Richard's silhouette disappear through the door before turning back to Emma. If you ever need help, just let me know. Emma looked at Johnny, still hesitant. She had never trusted powerful men, but Johnny, something about him felt different. She slowly nodded. I'll remember that. No one knew that this encounter was just the beginning of a revelation far more shocking. Inside the lavish penthouse at the top of the Grand Lux Hotel, Richard Langley sat in deep thought, swirling his wine glass absent-mindedly. It was already past noon, yet he couldn't shake the lingering tension from last night's banquet. Something had unsettled him, not the clash with Johnny Depp, nor Emma's defiant rejection, but the face of that girl, the sharp nose, the deep, determined eyes. It was too familiar. Richard ran a hand down the bridge of his nose, then recalled another face, one from 18 years ago. Back then, he had been a young entrepreneur, fiercely conquering the financial market. One night, after an intense business meeting, he had stopped by a small bar near the financial district. That was where he met Linda, a young waitress. She wasn't the glamorous type of woman he was used to, but there was something warm and genuine about her. They had spent the night together, a fleeting, uncommitted encounter. Then a few months later, Linda came looking for him with shocking news. She was pregnant. Richard had refused to accept it. He believed that he couldn't be tied down by a child, let alone be anchored to a waitress. He handed Linda a sum of money, demanded she get an abortion, then disappeared from her life without a second glance. But Linda never went through with the abortion. And now, seeing Emma standing there, with eyes filled with nothing but contempt, dragged all those buried memories back to the surface. Richard gripped his wine glass tightly, his eyes darkening. He needed confirmation, immediately. Richard pulled out his phone and dialed his most trusted assistant, Henry. "I need you to investigate someone," he said, his voice low, unable to mask the tension. Henry was skilled in matters like these, and within just a few hours, he returned with a detailed file. A woman named Linda Harrison. 18 years ago, she worked as a waitress at Le Petit Vin Bar. She became pregnant, but refused financial assistance from anyone. She later moved to a working-class neighborhood in the suburbs of Chicago, where she has raised a daughter on her own ever since. Richard didn't respond, flipping through the file in front of him. Emma Harrison, date of birth, March 12th. Father, not listed. Every word felt like a blade carving into Richard's conscience. He didn't need a DNA test. He already knew the truth. Emma was his daughter, a child he had abandoned. A daughter he had never watched over, never protected, never once reached out to. For the first time in his life, regret crept into Richard Langley's mind. But was it too late to make amends? 3 days later, as Emma was wiping down the bar counter at the restaurant, a tall figure stepped inside, none other than Richard Langley. The atmosphere in the restaurant instantly grew tense. The other employees clearly recognized him, but no one dared to speak. Emma looked up, her gaze turning ice cold the moment she saw him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice devoid of emotion. Richard slowly stepped closer, struggling to find the right words, something he had never experienced before. "We need to talk." "We?" Emma let out a dry laugh. "I don't think I have anything to say to a guest like you." Richard took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "I know that I am your father." The words fell into the space between them, like a thunderclap on a clear sky. Emma froze, her expression unreadable, but her eyes quickly filled with burning hatred. "And so what?" she scoffed, though her voice trembled with anger. "Do you expect me to cry tears of joy just because you did some digging and found out the truth?" Richard swallowed hard. "I know that I was wrong." Emma laughed, but there was a deep, hidden pain behind it. "Wrong?" She shook her head. "You weren't wrong. You just never cared. You had everything in your hands and you chose to leave me behind." Richard had no defense. She was right, but he hadn't come just to reveal the truth. He had come to make things right. "I want to help you. You don't have to work this hard. I can—" Emma raised a hand, cutting him off. "I don't need it," she snapped, her fists clenched tight. "Have you ever wondered how I survived the past 18 years? Have you ever even thought about the struggles I faced?" Richard remained silent. Emma let out a cold chuckle. "Now you show up, throwing money at me, thinking a few checks can erase the past?" Richard clenched his fists, the weight of her rejection hitting him like a punch to the chest. He had never imagined being turned away like this. Emma reached down, picked up the check Richard had placed on the table, and tore it in half right before his eyes. "You weren't there when I needed you, so don't pretend to care now." Richard stood motionless, stunned. Her words were sharp, final, like a sentence handed down to a man who had failed as a father. Emma didn't say another word. She simply turned and walked away, leaving Richard standing there, alone, full of bitterness and regret. For the first time in his life, Richard Langley realized that there were things money could never buy. It was late at night when Emma quietly made her way home. Her footsteps felt heavier than usual as she walked down the narrow path, leading to the small apartment she and her mother had shared for years. Her heart was still aching from the encounter with Richard Langley. That man, a millionaire, someone who believed money could solve everything, had turned out to be her biological father. But Emma felt no sense of pride, no joy, only an emptiness that refused to be filled. She felt nothing but hurt and resentment. Her mother had raised her alone for 18 years, never once mentioning Richard. And now, after all this time, he had returned as if he could make up for everything with nothing more than a name, number. She didn't need him. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. Linda, her mother, was sitting on the couch, looking at her with worried eyes. "You're home?" she asked gently, but the concern on her face was unmistakable. Emma nodded but didn't address the topic right away. She took off her coat, hung it up, and silently poured herself a glass of water. Only after regaining a bit of composure did she finally speak. "Mom, I need you to tell me the truth. Richard Langley, is he really my father?" Linda froze. The spoon in her hand trembled slightly, making a faint clinking sound against the glass. She didn't answer immediately, just gazed at her daughter for a long moment. And then, at last, she nodded. Yes. Just that one word was enough to shake Emma's entire world. She had prepared herself for this, but hearing it from her mother's lips still brought pain. "Why did you never tell me?" Emma's voice was thick with emotion. Linda let out a sigh. She placed her glass down on the table, her eyes drifting into memories she had buried for 18 years. "Because I didn't want you to carry that wound." And then she began to tell the story. About the day she met Richard Langley, a young man full of ambition, but also heartless. About how he had walked away the moment he learned she was pregnant, leaving behind a stack of money and cold, cruel words. Take care of it. But Linda had not taken care of it the way Richard had wanted. She had kept Emma. She had faced the loneliness, the struggles, and had chosen to be a mother even when the world turned its back on her. "I never once regretted keeping you," Linda whispered, her eyes filled with quiet determination. "No matter how hard it was, I never thought I made the wrong choice." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes. She couldn't begin to imagine the strength her mother had needed. But she knew one thing for sure. She would never accept Richard Langley into her life just because he felt guilty. "You raised me alone, so I can stand on my own without him." Linda looked at her daughter and smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "I knew you would say that." After that conversation with her mother, Emma felt as if a door had closed behind her. All the past, all the things she had never known, were now clear. But instead of breaking her, it only fueled her determination. She refused to live under the shadow of Richard Langley. She would prove to herself that she didn't need his name or his money to succeed. Emma threw herself into work. Every day she arrived at the restaurant earlier, learning everything she could from the senior managers. She observed how the operations were run, from menu planning to handling difficult customers. She ignored the curious looks from her co-workers as she pushed herself harder than ever. She paid no attention to the whispers about how Richard Langley was her father. She only focused on one thing, becoming the best. And no one noticed that more than Johnny Depp. Since rejecting Richard, Emma had poured every ounce of energy into her work. Not a single day passed where she allowed herself to slow down. She learned from the best chefs, observed every detail in restaurant management, from inventory control to customer service. No one handed her opportunities. She had to take them herself. At first, many doubted her. They whispered behind her back, saying an 18-year-old girl could never become a manager. But Emma didn't care. She didn't argue. She let her actions speak for themselves. Gradually, the restaurant staff began to see her differently. They watched her working late into the night, never hesitating to take on any task, whether it was wiping tables or washing dishes if needed. They saw her raise the standards for employees, yet always be the first to lend a helping hand. And then one day, the executive director of the restaurant chain came for an inspection. He spent hours observing Emma as she effortlessly managed everything, from customer service to staff coordination. After reviewing the operational reports, he called her into his office. Emma stepped inside, unsure of what to expect. But when she walked out, she had become the youngest manager in the restaurant's history. Emma might have become a manager, but she wasn't stopping there. One evening, Johnny Depp walked into the restaurant, silently watching her work. He had seen everything she had done to get to this point. When the restaurant closed for the night, he called her outside, his eyes filled with admiration. "Do you have time to talk?" Emma glanced at him, still focused on work. "I always have time for you," Johnny smiled. Emma took a deep breath. "I want to open my own restaurant." Johnny wasn't surprised. He had seen this coming a long time ago. "I figured you'd say that sooner or later." Emma didn't hesitate. "I've saved up a decent amount from my salary, but I know it's still not enough. If you could help me find an investor." Johnny burst into laughter. "Who do you think I am? Investing in young talent is my passion." Emma froze. "Are you saying—" Johnny placed a check in front of her. "This is the initial investment. You don't have to worry about interest or repayment. I only have one condition." Emma looked at him curiously. "What condition?" Johnny smiled. "Make it a success." Emma clenched the check in her hands. She wasn't just receiving financial help. She was being recognized by someone she deeply respected, and she knew she wouldn't let him down. Emma sat alone in the small office of the first restaurant she was about to open. Her dream was within reach, but one major obstacle remained: funding. She had worked tirelessly, saved every penny, and with Johnny's support, she had secured a location and started hiring staff. But after reviewing the final budget, she realized she was still short of what she needed to make everything perfect. At that moment, her phone buzzed, a notification from the bank. Her account balance had just increased by an astronomical amount, a sum so large that even in her wildest dreams, she had never imagined having it. She didn't need to ask who had sent it: Richard Langley. The man who had abandoned her mother, the man who once looked down on her, now sending this money as if he could buy forgiveness. Emma took a deep breath. This was a tough decision. She needed the money. If she accepted it, her restaurant could open on time. Everything could be completed without taking on debt. But if she took it, she would have to live with the feeling of owing someone she didn't respect. She picked up her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. A message from Johnny popped up. "What's wrong?" Emma stared at the message, then quickly typed back, "Nothing. I'll figure it out myself." Then she locked her phone, stood up, and walked out of her office. She had made her decision. She wouldn't touch that money, because this dream was hers, and she would make it happen on her own. Emma's first restaurant had officially opened and was running smoothly. She poured her heart into every detail, from sourcing the freshest ingredients to training her staff. Unlike other places, her restaurant didn't just serve fine cuisine, it fostered a respectful and fair work environment. Emma understood the value of every dollar earned, and she was proud of having built everything with her own hands. But then one day, Richard Langley appeared at her restaurant's entrance. This time, he no longer carried the arrogance he once had. There was hesitation in his stance, even a hint of unease. "Emma, we need to talk." He stood there looking at her with tired yet still proud eyes. Emma crossed her arms. "I don't think we have anything to discuss, Mr. Langley." Richard sighed. "I know you don't want to see me, but I have to admit, you've surprised me. You didn't take my money, you didn't rely on anything I could offer, yet you still succeeded. That made me rethink a lot of things." Emma raised an eyebrow. "So, are you here to congratulate me, or do you have some kind of offer?" Richard nodded. "I want to invest in your restaurant chain. You have talent, Emma. You could expand, grow into multiple cities, and I can help you do that." Emma laughed. "You think I would take your money now? That's where you were wrong from the start. You believe money can buy everything, but you forgot that some things are beyond wealth. Respect is one of them." Richard blinked, perhaps realizing that he had never been rejected so bluntly before, but he still tried. Emma, I know I was wrong. I want to make amends. Emma stared at him for a few seconds, then, without a word, stepped back into the restaurant. A moment later, she returned with a receipt. This is the full amount you sent me. I've transferred it back to your account. She placed the paper on a nearby table. I'm not someone who borrows and owes. If you truly want to redeem yourself, do it by being a better person, not with money. Richard stared at the receipt, stunned. He couldn't believe his own daughter was rejecting him so completely. For the first time in his life, he realized he had lost her forever. As time passed, Emma continued to grow her restaurant empire. With Johnny's support, she expanded into multiple locations and became a successful entrepreneur. She no longer thought about Richard. To her, he was simply a part of the past that she had left behind. But then one day, Emma received a letter. The sender, Richard Langley. She hesitated for a moment, then opened it. Emma, perhaps you will never forgive me, and I do not expect you to. But I want you to know that I am proud of you. You have achieved things I never thought you could. You have proven me wrong. Watching your success, I realize that no matter how much wealth I possess, I am still the loser. Because I have lost the most important thing, family. Even if you never accept me, I still want you to know that I truly regret everything. Richard. Emma finished reading the letter and gently placed it down. She didn't cry, nor did she feel moved. Instead, a strange sense of calm washed over her. There was a time when she had hoped he would change, but after looking into his life, she knew that he remained the same, still living the way he always had, still preying on young women for his own pleasure before disappearing without a trace. A man like that did not deserve forgiveness. Emma picked up the letter, tore it into tiny pieces, and tossed them into the trash. She stepped outside where her employees were bustling about, preparing for another day. She knew her future did not lie in the painful memories of the past. It lay in what she was building, with her own hands. She smiled. She had chosen her own path, and she had no regrets. Life is not simply about what we are given, but how we choose to face it. Emma was not born into wealth, nor did she have the protection of a powerful father. But she never let that hold her back. One starting point does not determine their future. Willpower is what truly matters. Money cannot buy everything, especially love and respect. Forgiveness is a choice, but sometimes refusing to forgive is the best way to protect oneself. If you keep fighting for your dreams, you can write your own destiny. Emma refused to accept the fate that others had imposed on her. She chose her own path, and most importantly, she did not let the past define her. Our choices shape our destiny, and you can do the same.